Hi, everyone. Welcome to Community Homeworks Education Center. My name is Sam. I'm the education coordinator here. Our mission here at Community Homeworks is to empower our neighbors to maintain safe, stable, and sustainable homes for generations. So hopefully these workshops help you in maintaining your home and learn a little something new. Today, it's all about wall repairs. So Tasha put a fun Great Wall of China fun fact to get us rolling in the wall mood. And it's taught by our wonderful instructor, Mr. Lee Taylor. I'll go ahead and let him take it away.
All right.
Oh, and any reminder, you guys have been here before, but if you haven't signed up, go ahead and grab some more snacks. Bathrooms up there, and we'll enjoy the class. If you have questions, just shout them out.
All right. So yeah, this is wall repair, and sorry, I just realized I didn't have an outline. I do like to go through and kind of get a feel if somebody is wanting to get something specific out of this class, and also how old their house is. That tells me a lot about the walls. So does anybody want something specific or trying to get something specific?
I have something specific.
Okay.
In our basement is it's refinished.
Right.
And there's just some holes in drywall, so just like solid holes.
Okay.
I can't see. It's just dark.
Okay.
So probably fix that.
Okay. Anybody else? How old your house?
Built in the 50s, but the basement was probably finished like
Recently.
a decade ago.
Okay. All right. Anybody else? Yeah.
Is there a way to like go back and like fix like drywall seams that are like very messy looking?
Yeah.
Our basement also was finished at some point, and it appears to have been a DIY project.
Yep.
And it really looks like, I mean, the seams ugly.
Okay. Yeah. There are ways to deal with that. So, did you guys have it? Oh, and how old your place?
It was built in 1999.
Oh, okay. You're newer then, sure.
79.
79. No real questions.
No.
Not even in yet.
Oh, well, there you go. All right. So the reason I asked for the age on the homes is most of these houses in this area are plaster and lath, and you deal with those. You can deal with those a little bit differently. For the rest of the houses, it's just your standard drywall. Some of the houses in the 50s may have used what's called plasterboard. So there's a little variation on that, but I want to go through real quick on the lath and plaster. This is the lath. They go horizontally, against the studs, and they have this spacing in between. So back in the day when they did plaster work, they did a base coat, and what that did is that base coat would squeeze in behind, between the lath and create a little lock once it dried, and then they'd apply, the top coats to that. What happens over time with the plaster walls are those little tabs of plaster start breaking off. And that can happen with impacts, that can happen with temperatures, fluctuation, all sorts of things, just age in general. So what happens is that plaster starts to separate from that lath. And a lot of times that's usually the issue that people have, is that they have a big area where they touch it and the whole wall just kind of goes, like this. And they want to try to get a feel on how to work with that. The other types, this doesn't really show it fully, but yeah, it does. I need a thing that turns. sure I can turn this. Better wheels, right? Come on. Can you see this? So, this is your more standard 2x4 framing, with your drywall put on top, and it's usually probably you're going to find in the bathroom or in the basements and stuff like that. How the drywall well, let me back up a little bit. No one has plaster? You do? Okay. So with plaster walls, I want to try to turn this thing again. With plaster walls, yeah, there's the trick. All right. So if you are getting into that issue where you're having that plasters wanting to release, do you have that?
I think so. I can hear it sometimes fall down.
Yeah, you'll hear it, or you can go up to it and press it, and you'll see it. You can actually see it kind of bulging out. It usually starts on the ceilings. So with that, the best thing you can do with that is to very, very, very gently remove that plaster down to the lath. And the issue with that is that the thickness can vary all over the place. I've seen it where plaster is, 1.5 inches thick down to, 1/2 inch thick on the same wall. So they took up a lot of variances in that structure with that plaster. So a lot of times, if I'm doing that, I'm going to remove the loose part of that plaster, and you have to be careful with that. Usually, what I'll do is I will put down plastic and carefully remove that plaster. Try to minimize the dust. You can take it in. It might be one of those things you want to do. Actually, you can take that plaster in and see if it has any nasty things in it. You can have it tested at a place here in Kalamazoo. Sometimes it has asbestos in it, so you gotta kind of keep that in mind. So before tearing into that, yeah, I would have that checked out. Other than that, you try to just keep down the dust to a minimum. You can gently mist it with some, I'm not saying soak it, but, mist it a little bit as you're working to be able to pull that plaster off. But you want to only get it to where that plaster is loose. So beating on it with a hammer is not a good idea, because all that's going to do is make it break even further. And then all of a sudden you have an entire room that is nothing but lath. So gently pull it off and get down to something where it's stable. And at that point, what you can do is you'll have, this is a crude representation, but you'll have something similar to this, right? And a lot of times, especially if you have, small holes or, whatever, you'll have that lath back behind there, and you can actually screw pieces of drywall to that lath. So that, in that sense, it makes it a little bit easier. And you can get drywall in all different thicknesses. So what I'll like to do is, remove that loose plaster, clean the lath up, because you don't want, you want it smooth. You don't want it, pieces of plaster sticking in there and pushing that drywall out. So clean that all up. And then you can get different thicknesses of drywall. So you can go out and buy, a 4x8 sheet, or usually it's cheaper just to buy a full sheet and cut the thing and throw it in your car or your truck or something like that than it is to buy those little areas. But you can buy all different thicknesses. So what I like to do is, and this is real crude, but I like to make it so that the plaster or the drywall that you're putting in is just a hair less as far as the thickness goes than what's existing. The reason is that when you go ahead and you mud that and everything else, I didn't do the greatest of jobs, but when you go to mud that and everything else, if it's just below the existing surface, you can fix that with mud. If it's sticking out, it's that much harder. So you know, that part is relatively easy. If for some reason you don't have lath, or let's say you have just a drywall area, and it depends on how big the hole is, really what it boils down to. If you have a small, I want to say like most of the time it's a doorknob that goes through the wall, right? You can use things like this. I'm going to pass these around. Pass that guy around. So you have different patches. They have like a wire mesh on them, and they have a sticky back. It's a fiberglass mesh with usually a piece of metal or something along that line in there. And they're designed for those smaller, kind of like a doorknob or something along that line, right? Where what you can do is you can put in a piece of drywall or something as a backer, and then you can put this over the top, and it makes it so that you can finish over the top of that. And obviously this wouldn't work for this size, but they come in all different sizes. I mean, that's like a 6-inch there. If there's nothing behind it, you do want to try to get something in behind it. That can get tricky sometimes. So, I mean, if you have just an empty void, right, and there's nothing behind it whatsoever, you can do a couple of different tricks. The one I like best is, you've all seen the paint stir sticks. You can get the 5-gallon paint stir sticks for free, right? And what you do is you put those behind, and I'll hold one usually like this, and I'll run a drywall screw in, and so it sucks up to the back end of the drywall, and then do the same thing here, and then put another one in, just so you have a couple of areas to be able to screw that drywall onto, right? If it's a larger area, sometimes it's easier just to find your stud, and, you know, depending, most studs are separated. There's about a 16-inch spacing between them. So you can carefully remove that drywall or plaster or whatever until you're onto each stud. You want to go about halfway onto that stud. So your stud's roughly 1.5 inches wide. So cut that and then square that piece up, and it's going to make your life a lot easier as far as to be able to cut that drywall to be able to match. So like I said, there's a lot of different ways to be able to put that drywall up. You just want to have something solid to be able to screw to. A lot of times people ask, you know, well, can I just get drywall mud and, you know, fill the hole with that mud? Yeah, yes, no. It sort of depends. You know, if you're in that mode and you're going to do something like that, usually what I'll do is, you still want some kind of a backer on it. And usually what I'll do at that point is, I'm going to fill that void. It'd be something much smaller than this. I'm going to fill that void up with a thinner layer of joint compound, or the drywall mud. Let that dry, and then put another coat on top. All right. The issue is, you guys may want to move up a little closer, because I'm opening things up. You can't see them necessarily. So the drywall mud, and this is your general, green is your general purpose drywall mud. It's going to do most of the work you need. There are a couple of different styles out there. Green is your general. And there's one that has a blue tub also. That is called a topping compound. And what that is it's meant for the final coats. It's easier to sand. It has a smoother texture. It gives you a better finish. The thing to remember about drywall is there's hanging, and then there's finishing. And finishing is definitely one of those things that takes a while to learn. It is more of an art form than it is anything else. but we're going to go over some of the basics on it. So as far as the screws I'm going to use, you can get, you know, your standard drywall screws are 1 5/8. They make them that length so that they don't penetrate wires and whatnot in a 2x4 where there's, you know, wires running through the center of it. But sometimes you may have to up that, depending if you have a real thick, you need at least, I like to have at least a 1/2 inch, usually a little bit more to dig in. We don't have a screw gun. Can you grab one out of there, please? So when you're putting that drywall in, and if let's say it's this situation like this, I'm going to cut that piece out. Now you can cut that piece out a couple of different ways. You can use just a utility knife and cut a piece like I did. You can also, thank you. I need a Phillips, please. Or you can use what's called a jab saw, and that's where you can actually cut, you know, a circle or something along that line to get closer. Like I said, this is for representation, so I normally wouldn't leave a gap like that. Gap like that, that's all right. But a bigger one like that, no. So when you go to put those pieces in, I'm going to go ahead and run these in. Another benefit to having that screw or that thickness of that plaster or thickness of that drywall to be a little thinner than your existing is you normally have to countersink your screws in, especially if they're flush. So if I can find a stud here. All right, there's a stud right here. So when you put these in, that's number one. There's a paper on this drywall. And what you want to do is you want to countersink the head of that screw in enough to where it hasn't broken the paper on that drywall, but also so that it's not protruding, because again, you're not going to necessarily cover that up. So what a lot of people will do if they're putting on a larger area and they know that what they're doing is going to be flush with the existing wall, they will go ahead and run their screws in. You can use, you know, a drill driver or something like that, set the clutch down. They'll go ahead and set them just to get it up. But then the trick is to find the ones that are just above the surface a little bit. So what I'll do is I'll get a putty knife and I'll run, and that putty knife will click when you hear when that screw head is sticking out a little bit. This is where it can get tricky because that paper is not that thick at all. And what some people will do is, like I said, they'll set that clutch way down on a drill driver, just enough to sink that in. Some people will just grab a hand screwdriver, just a couple of turns to push that in. If you break the paper, and you'll know when you do because it just blows right through it. I can't find one here. Go ahead and put another screw in, because at that point, that screw pretty much is lost its strength. Nothing saying you couldn't, you know, in this sort of situation, nothing saying you couldn't put a little adhesive behind it also. And then the screws are there just to hold that, right? So a couple of different ways as far as attaching it goes. But when, you know, if you're doing it in this situation here, the wall moves when I don't want it to move, right? I can run that in and see there, I actually punched through the paper a little bit, but that's not that big a deal. And I'll throw another one right there and make that so that that piece that I'm putting in, yeah, and because that's low, that's going to be all right. So once you get that attached, you're going to want to get your drywall mud. And you're going to want to have the drywall mud. And you're going to want to also have some tape. And I'll show you what the tape is. I'm not going to get much out. Now, drywall mud, all sorts of different types out there. Generally, green is the most common. Like I said, blue is what you're going to use when you're doing finish work. We'll just talk about the green today. Clean the sides of your bin. When you're done, this drywall mud has a tendency to dry up quickly, and it's really maddening when you go to do your finish work and you have clumps of dried stuff in there. So I always, when I'm done with that bucket, I'm going to scrape the sides and get it all in the center, and I'll actually put a little bit of water in it. We got water? Can you give me one of those waters? Will you drink it if I open it? No, I don't. So what I like to do, and this is just me, I add just a little bit of water, not much at all. And what that's going to do is it's going to make that mud just a little more workable. You don't want it thinned out necessarily, but all you're doing is just making it so that it's a little creamier. If you mix it up and it's too thin, you can always add a little bit more mud to it, joint compound to it. Now, what's the right consistency? That's one of those things that's kind of personal preference. My thing is this: if I can hold it on my, if it's moving at about that rate, that's about right for me. You can have it a little thicker if you want to, especially if you're filling it in a larger area. That is one of those things that is up to you. But again, you know, you don't want to get too much in there. Then as far as the mudding and stuff goes, I'm going to get a pan like this. And I'm just going to go through, and what I'm doing is I'm filling in those little voids, right? And it doesn't have to look super pretty at this point. You're not going to leave it like this, but you want to get these little voids filled in. That you wouldn't want to try to fill in. But, and you may have to work that mud a little bit differently. And you see how what's happening right there with that one screw that's sticking up beyond that paper? It's causing issues, but for our purposes right now, we're not going to fuss with that too much. So once those are filled in, what you're going to do is where that connection or where that joint is between the two types of material, you need to put a piece of tape on there. And it can be paper tape. It can be a couple of different style tapes. Because if you don't, it'll look good initially, but it will crack. And that's what that paper does, is that makes it so that it is less likely to crack. All right. So I'll put on a thin coat. And you see how you can see that crack through that area? I'll put on a thin coat. And then you get into variations on the types of tape. So, you can see it from here. So your standard paper tape, that is pretty common, and there's really not much wrong with that. It does require, occasionally it requires a little bit more work. Oh, sure. You can even send some around with this. So that paper tape does have a tendency to require a little bit more work. This is a fiberglass mesh tape that's really nice. It actually kind of just disappears, and it still gives all the strength that you're going to need for that joint. And then you're going to have this stuff also. This is a self-stick. Very annoying. Send around that one. So what this is designed for, this style is designed where you don't have to have the bed of mud to bed that tape into. I will say this. You see how stringy that stuff is? When this mud dries, I guarantee there's going to be little things sticking out of it, and you're like cutting them and cutting them. And it drives me nuts. Some people love it, though. But there are different options out there. So in this case, for the paper, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just, get a rough idea how much I'm going to need and cut it. Some people like to have wet this paper down a little bit. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that in. And you want to have that mud. You want to have that paper bedded into that mud. If you have a corner like this where there's nothing behind it, and that happens, all you need to do is grab your mud and you can put a little behind it so that beds in. And what I'm doing is I'm going to push that tape. So I'm actually pushing that mud out around it, right? And it looks ugly. And then the other one I'm going to do right here. Generally, I'm not going to want to necessarily overlap that type of tape, because it's just going to be a ridge that you're going to have to deal with to try to cover up later when it comes time to do the finish work. And the finish work is, like I said, that's the nightmare. So you see how this is in? It's bedded in. I don't want any bubbles or anything like that. I'm going to push out any excess, right? With this style tape, I can put that on and smooth that out. And that tape is just about totally disappearing at that point, right? You'll see a little bit of it, but you don't worry about that right yet. So you're going to go through and bed in all your tape. Obviously, you'd have your tape cut up and whatnot beforehand, so you're not letting this stuff dry. And then what I'll do is, once I have my tape on there, I'm going to go through and wipe off that excess. And why am I wiping off that excess? Because it all boils down to sanding. And sanding is usually what ends up getting people in trouble. So I'm going to let that dry. And then what I'm going to have is, this tape's going to be all the way around. I'm going to let it dry. And then I'm going to, you can use the green, or you can switch over to the blue, the topper compound. And I'm kind of jumping the gun, but I'm doing this for purposes of whatever. There are a lot of different styles of drywall knives out there. Generally, what you're going to want to do is, it depends on how big of an area you're finishing, okay? For an area like this, you can use a wider putty knife, or you can use, see, this is a little narrow. A lot of knives, I have a knife at home that's 12 inches wide. And what it does is it fans, there's a bug. It fans out that mud so that you don't necessarily see those ridges and whatnot. So after it's dry, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get my mud. This is where you want to make sure that you don't have crud in it, little dried up pieces and whatnot. And again, this is probably not going to work real hot because it is. And this is where you want a light hand. And I don't know if you can see this or not. You may want to come up here if you want to see this a little bit better, because some of these details are hard to see, and I'm getting tangled up in my cord. All right. You get a bug in there. So see how you can see that edge of that paper? So that that in itself for the first initial top coat, not necessarily that big a deal. All right. What you don't want is you don't want that paper sticking out. Sometimes after it dries, you may have a situation where, and I'll just do it this way, where you have bubbles going on behind it. And what you want to do with that is, and that's why I like to have it dry ahead of time. You can always pull that up a little bit, put in more mud behind it, and be able to bed that tape in. See those cruddies I was talking about? That's that stuff starting to dry on us. So, and that's part of that thinning that mud out just a little bit. It makes it so it's a lot smoother to work with. But trick when you're doing finish work is to have a putty knife or a mudding knife that does not have any dings in it, anything like that. And you want to have a light hand on it. Usually where people get zapped is they play with it too much. You know, they're like, oh, so there's a little bump there, and they go after it. You know, it starts to dry on you, and it's just like, it drives you nuts. So to me, something like that is about right. And, you know, you just do that around the whole thing. Again, if it's a, you know, thinner piece, you can just go ahead and fill that because, again, it's less than that, about ½ inch or so. And you put the paper on those seams and stuff, and you can mud over it, let it dry, and you're going to end up with something similar to this, right? So when you get down to that, you're going to be working on sanding it. Can you still hear me on this side? Okay. Sorry, it's kind of. So I call them hard edges. Don't ask me if that's an actual term, but a lot of times you're going to notice where that drywall mud is stopped in whatever surface it's on. So when you're sanding it, I go around and knock down those real hard edges first so that they're feathered out, similar to this. And you can see what I'm talking about right here. So come here and foil this. You can even see this, right? That, you know, these edges like this. And you will see that through the paint. So, yeah, I mean, and sometimes your eyes are going to play tricks on you. So what I'll do is I'll go through and sand it down, and I guarantee you that the first time you're sanding, it feels like you're sanding and sanding and sanding. You got piles of, you know, dust all over the floor, and then you're putting more mud on. But again, that's the learning curve, you know. What grade is sandpaper? So there are a lot of different grades. Generally, this is a sanding screen. So this comes in different grits and stuff, you know. So, and they even have a really, really fine grit that you would use for your final, right? This is a little heavier grit to be able to knock down those edges and stuff. So you can use a sanding block. You can use just a block of wood with sandpaper wrapped around it. What you don't want to use is just your hands. What will happen is you'll get these ridges in there, and then you'll be working on trying to get those out. So as I'm going along and I'm sanding in long strokes, right? Yeah, it's probably a good thing. We're not too much dust, but I've sucked up so much drywall dust. I'm just over it at this point. Yeah, you can use a mask. You can use the dust mask, but it's not really going to stop much. That drywall dust is really fine.
How much pressure do you want to apply?
Well, so it boils down to how hard that drywall mud that you put on is. So, and this is where you get those little variances. You get the green compound is a little more durable, little harder to sand, right? Versus the topping compound, which is much finer particles in it, and it's a lot easier to sand. I would say that if you're not sure, stop sanding. Because there's a trick you can do.
So like I said, I'll go around the edges, knock down those hard edges, and then I'll go through in long sweeps, you know, and sand down that area. I will get a damp rag, lightly damp, and just wipe that area down. Wipe that area down. And sometimes that's going to show these little imperfections and stuff like that. But also, what it's going to do is it's going to show spots where it may be lower or higher. Just depends. And a lot of times you can use your hands. So what I'll do is if it looks good, I'm going to run my hands over it. And usually I can tell if there's a spot, you know. Well, feel right here. Feel this spot right here. It looks pretty good, right? Now use your whole hands. Just run your, feel that? Right. So now you got drywall dust. But, you know, like I said, your hands are going to tell you a lot more sometimes than your eyes. So, you know, go through, sand it down, do whatever. Apply more mud if you need to. What I'll do sometimes is it may be just a couple little spots. So I'll get a pencil and I'll mark it. And then I'll get my, say, topping compound or whatever compound I'm using. And I'll just go over those areas and put it in, feather it out a little bit. Again, don't fuss with it too much. Let it dry, sand it again, right? Yeah. So when you're relatively happy with it and you think you're ready for primer and stuff, wipe it down really good, because like my wife said, that little bit of dust can cause that primer not to bond and the paint not to bond, and it'll drive you nuts, right? Because it'll just peel right off. So I wipe it down with a lightly damp rag. Then I'll wipe it down again, usually. But what you can do is you can put a primer coat on it, because you can put drywall mud and stuff over primer. So what people will do is they'll put a drywall primer on it. And then what they can do is you can get a trouble light, because a lot of times if you're looking straight onto it, you can't really see some of those imperfections. But if you put a primer coat on it and you have somebody hold like a trouble light like this and look down that wall this way, you'll see all those little imperfections pop out, right? And then you can do the same thing. You get your pencil and mark either, hey, I got to sand this down or I got to fill this in, right? So you want to go through those steps. As far as drywall that has been already done, that can be tricky. Is it the corners?
No, it's like the
Seem right about, yeah. So when they sell drywall, it comes in sheets 4 foot high by 8 foot to 12 foot, right? It just depends. And this is for much larger projects. But there's usually a seam right about here where the drywall tapers. I can actually show this to you. You can see you can actually see that taper. So that's more if you're working on, like I said, larger areas. And usually what happens is it, well, I guess what you want to do if you have drywall that has a bad finish on it, is put some kind of a straight edge on there. Usually the wider the better. And I can put it right on there and I can tell if it's rocking, it's too high, you know, I mean, or vice versa, right? So you can use that straight edge to kind of give you a feel for what needs to happen. Usually the worst case scenario is that they didn't sand it enough. This is where it can get tricky, and it depends on how many layers of paint there is on it, all sorts of things. Sometimes it's easier just to get in there with like a sharp utility knife and score that a little bit and pull that stuff out and start new.
The issue you want to be careful with is if you tear that drywall paper like that, that can be an issue. You don't want to just try to mud over that. Usually what you're going to want to do is get your thinner, that's where I like this stuff a lot, because I can put a thin coat over that and I can put, a couple of layers on it. I don't necessarily want them overlapping, but I can put a couple layers and it basically takes the place of that paper once it's all said and done, right? So yeah, you can fix it. It's work. And depending on how much there is, and depending on how much time you have, it's one of those things where you may want to find out how much it is for a professional to come in, because they will make you sick. They will just go and walk away and come back and sand it and one more coat and they're done, versus the do-it-yourself sort of thing. So take it for what it's worth, but do realize that if it's your first time finishing, that's the part that's going to drive you nuts. So does that make sense up to this point? All right. And I mean, all the same rules apply, as far as, if you're using, let's say you're using a patch like this, one of these metal patches. These work fine. But again, they say they're self-adhesive. I usually will throw a little mud in behind them for laughs. But they will make, they'll make a pretty good base. But again, you wouldn't want, let's say this was your hole. I wouldn't want to put that right over. I'd want to go ahead and fill that up first and then put this over and then treat it all pretty much the same. All right. Now, as far as drywall cracks and stuff like that, usually where you're going to find those issues are on inside corners. I don't care if it's an inside corner on your ceiling or an inside corner like this. You may notice that there might be cracking or something going on there. All right. If you have that situation, pay attention to that crack. And it sounds goofy, but pay attention to it for a little while and see if it opens and expands, right? Expands out and closes. And the reason I say that is that you can go ahead and get drywall mud, right, and patch it and put your tape over it and stuff. Sometimes that wall is moving and it's just going to crack that drywall right out again, right? Or that joint compound. It's just going to crack it out again. So what you want to do is, in those situations for little hairline cracks, you can get what's called painter's caulk. A lot of times it's called Alex. And you want one that's like a good 45-year caulk. And you go through, fill that in with caulk, smooth it out with a damp rag, and then paint over it once it's dried. And a lot of times that's going to be able to deal with that expansion and contraction of all the different materials reacting to humidity and however dry it is and stuff. So that's one way to deal with that. Sometimes you just get cracks that no matter what you do, they just keep coming back. Can that be an issue of something else? Yes and no. Sometimes, I've seen it where they've had, we had this one house that they had the trusses and they put them on a top plate, right? And those trusses did this, depending on what the temperature in the attic was doing, right? Or the temperature outside. And so you get this crack right in the corner. And it did not want to go away, no matter how hard you tried. So, yeah. The plaster? Yep. The walls buckled itself? Yeah, and that's what I was talking about in the beginning. So if you have that situation where that plaster is buckling or pulling away from that wall, gently remove it. Don't take a hammer to it. Most of the time, all you need to do is just, get it open and start pulling it off. We talked about
having it checked. You should have it checked out just to make sure there's no nasties in it. Get it down to where it's stable, and then you're going to have a situation like this where you have the lath board behind it. Clean it, do all this so that what you put on top is not pushing that drywall out, and patch it just like this. We just had one in a house that I'm working on right now where it was a kid's room, and 4 foot up all the way around was that lath or that plaster was just falling off. So we just took it off and bought 4x8 sheets of 1/4 inch drywall, actually, and they come in all different thicknesses. Put it right on top of the lath and did our finishing and feathered it into the plaster wall up top. And it works out really nice. So there are a lot of different types of drywall out there, thicknesses and color. So we'll talk about the thickness of it. There is nothing saying you couldn't do 2 layers of, 1/4 and a half or whatever you need to do, right, to be able to get it close. The 1/4 inch, if you're doing a larger area, to go right over the lath boards. The only reason I like 1/4 inch is that it's lighter and it's easier to manage. So take that for what it's worth, right? As far as the types of drywall, you'll see some that's green or purple or something along that line. And those are usually designed for high moisture areas, bathrooms, stuff like that. Anybody doing work in bathrooms? No? Okay. So if you are doing something in a high moisture area, get a moisture rated drywall. And so it's usually purple or blue or green. It just depends on who makes it. And that is supposed to do better in high moisture areas. Sometimes it does not. When it comes time to actually cut the drywall itself, so if you're cutting big sheets of it, right, or you're cutting even little small areas, what you want to do over here. So you have a front side and a back side. You always want to cut the front, and you can use. Can you grab that drywall T-square for me, please? You can use freehand, usually just a utility knife. And what you're going to want to do is, all you're doing is scoring that paper on the front. Thank you. It is. So you just score that paper on the front side. You're going to stand it up, or if it's a smaller piece, you can hit it, break it like that, and then you cut the back side, and then you'll have your piece. Don't try to cut all the way through it. It's a pain. If it's a bigger sheet, that's where you use this. And, if you have, like, say, a 4x8 sheet and you only need it, 5 feet long, this is designed to be able to sit right on top, and I can either mark it and freehand it, or I can run my knife right up the side of this to get a nice clean cut. So drywall T-square is nice for that, larger projects and stuff. As far as when that piece is cut, sorry, I'm going to keep moving around. You're going to get a really jagged edge. And sometimes what people will do is you can be real basic and just use your knife and, go like this just to kind of smooth it up. If it's a larger area and you have a real rough cut like that, you can get what's called a sure form and just do that a couple of times. And it's just going to make it so it's a much smoother finish to be able to put in there. So like I said, this is just drywall. This is just gypsum. But it does make a mess. So, and when you're putting that in, and what you always want to do is dry fit it to make sure. I've seen where people start ramming screws into it, and then they're having to pull them out because something's not right. So I always dry fit to make sure that it's going to fit where I want it to fit, and be able to run those screws in. Now, as far as the screws go, there are a couple of different styles out there. So you have fine thread, and you have coarse thread. That's it. So you have a fine thread and coarse thread screws. A lot of times the finer thread, the finer screws, or the finer thread screws are really kind of designed for metal studs. Most of the time, DIYers are not dealing with metal studs. So you want the coarse threaded screws. They're going to grab whatever the studs, the wood, much better to be able to make it so that they actually grab. Doesn't mean you can't use the other one, no. But if you have a choice, yeah, pick those coarse threaded. And then the length boils down to what we talked about before, how much you're actually going in and how thick. You know, in this one here, like I said, at least a ½ inch into whatever it is that you're digging into. So to be able to sink that in. As far as the inside corners go, that can be tricky. So back to this good old paper tape. If you get the paper tape, I keep putting this in my pocket. I shouldn't do that. If you're using the paper tape to do an inside corner, what you can do is it's got a crease in it. So you'll notice that it already has a crease, so you can actually fold that. You think the other stuff is difficult? Yeah, this is real fun. So you make sure your drywall secure. You want one out like this, right? I make sure that none of the screws are sticking up, and I'm going to bed. I'm going to put a bedding in for, and we'll see if this is going to work. I'm going to put a bed down for that inside corner. And normally, yes, that drywall is not supposed to be moving, but for our purposes tonight, we're just doing this, right? So you're putting in that bed. I'm going to usually use a wider knife. Sometimes they call it a taping knife. They're like 2.5 inches wide. And then what I'm going to do, can you guys see that? I have to try to turn this thing again. So you're going to start, obviously, I like to start at the top, but you're going to bed that in, right? And then you're going to get your knife. And the trick is to not have this thing buckle on you and fold, right? And, you know, a short piece like this is relatively easy to do, right? Trick is when you start getting longer pieces or longer sections, and what that tape will start to do is start to wrinkle on you. And believe me, it is a nightmare to try to fix it. The longer that paper tape sits on there, it has a tendency to get really, really soft, and it can tear. So they do sell for inside corners, and this is not necessarily a good representation, but this is for outside corners. But they have pre-made paper inside corners and outside corners, where this one has a metal, but you can find this in any of the box stores. You can buy them in, 8-foot, 10-foot sticks. Cut the stuff and put it right in, and it's relatively rigid. And what that's nice for is to give you that nice straight line. Because sometimes what will happen is that either on an inside corner or up on a ceiling, if you're using paper and you haven't had that much practice, you're going to look at that wall and it's going to be doing this because that paper is dipping and diving and everything else. So I like to get those somewhat rigid corners. And like I said, a couple of different styles out there. You can do the types of the metal in them. You can do the types of the plastic in it. Some come in rolls that you actually cut and then you fold them and stuff. And they make your job a lot easier. They make it go a lot faster. Yes, they cost a little bit more than just a roll of paper, but the end result is so much better. Outside corners. I don't really have an outside corner here. Well, I do. I'm going to try to turn this thing again. Here it goes. Right? So your outside corners like this, this is where, yeah, they're not blowing apart. This is where you definitely want some kind of a rigid corner. And everything, all the same rules apply. Most of the time, when you buy these, they're metal. And I'm sure you've all seen, you got to tell me when my time's almost up. Okay. What? Yeah, that clock's off. I'm like, oh, I got some time. Most of the time, they're metal. And what happens is over time, they get hit, they get dinged, and you have all these dings in the drywall, right? So if you have those plastic style with the paper over it, you can put that on, and it makes that outside corner much more durable as far as furniture, kids hitting it, or whatever. And it's also going to give you a nice straight line. So those are some of the products out there that are available now. You can see these here. These are actually sunk in correctly. If you want to come up and see them a little closer, you can. Versus this guy, this is where that has punched through that paper and it's not holding anything anymore. Is that super important on a wall? Yeah. Is it more important on the ceiling? Oh, yeah. You don't want a big chunk of drywall falling down to the ceiling. So that's where you got to really watch it, how far you're going in. They do sell screw guns that are strictly designed for drywall hanging. They can be a little pricey for a little project. So that's why most people don't have them. But they do sell them. If you're the kind of person that wants to have that tool, they are made for drywall hanging. So as far as I'll talk about real quick about plaster cracks, because that's another big thing that usually is the case as far as people having cracks in their plaster. And the plaster itself is in good shape, but it just has a bunch of those hairline cracks. If you have a situation like that, I would personally I'd go out and buy a roll of this fiber mesh like this and go ahead and you want to clean that crack out. So what you're doing is that there's usually a lot of loose pieces of plaster in there and stuff. And you just get a utility knife or a screwdriver or whatever and clean that out. You actually want to make it kind of a V groove in that crack. Clean it out, get it all dried off. I have a little hand broom that I'll go in there just to clean all the loose stuff out. And then you go ahead and you bed in your mud, you have your tape, put that right over it. And then at that point, you're just feathering out from that point out. So the finished work itself. If I was to give you one more detail as far as finishing goes, like I said, when it looks good, stop. And if you have a larger area, do longer strokes. Those longer strokes are going to make it so that mud is going to be able to smooth out a lot easier. That's where thinning that mud down, like I showed you in the beginning, is going to make that much of a difference. The guys that I used to hang around were finishers for like 30 years. They put Dawn dish soap in their mud. But hey, they did really good work. So, and most of the time when you're mixing that mud up, you can mix it in the pan itself. Some people will, if you have a bigger project, they may want to get something like this. They can hook to their drill and actually mix up the tub itself or put it in like a 5-gallon tub or whatever, mix it up. Just realize that once you do that, you're pretty committed. So that's where for smaller projects, it's not necessarily worth getting into all this, but just mixing it up in your pan as you go. So I think I ran out of time. Is there any questions at all? Yeah. That's what I was talking about. So the plaster cracks, yeah, that's where you want to scratch those cracks out and put something over it. That a lot of back in the day they use these, right? But the issue with this is that it is really hard to not see that crosshatch pattern through that drywall mud, especially once you sand it. And then you start getting into that game of I can see it, so you add more mud, and then it just goes downhill from that point. So not that I've done that. Yeah, I've done that. So, but yeah, that's a way to deal with it. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah.
I got a bunch of stuff to clean up. That's
All
fine.
right, well, again, thank you again for coming to the wall repairs workshop. It's nice to see some familiar faces. Thank you, Mr. Taylor, for your wonderful instruction.
No
It
problem.
was very helpful. I just wanted to close up with some announcements. Tomorrow we do have a Handy at Home Pink, so that's dedicated to women, workshop that is Introduction to Power Tools. So that'll be hands-on. That starts at 5:30. So if you want some hands-on experience, we'll wear some goggles and we'll get to work. And then the following Wednesday is another Handy at Home Pink that'll be toilet repairs. And if you want to see Mr. Taylor again, your next workshop is November 12th, winter maintenance. So that is a very important one. And then I wanted to give you guys a little preview. It's not on the website yet, but we will have a fall open house November 9th. So from 12 to 3, please stop in. It's a Saturday. We'll have some refreshments. It'll be a soft launch of our tool library. So we'll be able to like open it up to you guys and you can check it out, see what it's all about. And see updates for the education. But otherwise, I'll let you guys go on with your nights and enjoy this lovely evening.